after 30 years, being the personal reactions on the AA way of life by Sturge. This is not a history of AA in Australia. Others have written brief accounts of the first attempts to get a group functioning in Sydney. I could write only about my own association with AA, which has had little to do with those early days. My contact dates from the day in 1945 when Archie McKinnon asked me to help the small group of alcoholics who at last were meeting regularly in the Tock-H rooms in Walker Street, North Sydney. The men were recruited from the reception house in Darlinghurst, where Archie was a psychiatric attendant. But no new members were attracted, and there was a possibility of this venture ending in failure as previous attempts had. Archie wanted me to talk about AA and the group in Walker Street in my radio session, Let's Talk It Over, which dealt with all sorts of problems sent in to me by mail. Archie was surprised to hear that I had been mentioning AA in the session for some time, but only the movement in the United States of America, which was having wonderful results. My information was from a Reader's Digest article condensed from a book by Harry Emerson Fosdick on being a real person. But I only knew that it had as its main platform dependence on a power greater than themselves. I was delighted to know that there was actually a small group in Sydney, and I immediately started broadcasting the good news that anyone who had an alcoholic problem could make contact with the group through me. There was no one in Australia who had achieved sobriety through the AA program of recovery, known as the 12 Steps. Archie lent me one of the very few copies in Australia of the textbook with the title Alcoholics Anonymous. I had read the book with great interest, particularly the chapters dealing with how to use the 12 steps. In attending with Archie a meeting of the group in Walker Street, I met Dr. Minot, Father Tom Donnelly, and a non-alcoholic like myself, the Jesuit priest, Father Richard Murphy. It was soon apparent that the small group of alcoholics knew little about the application of the 12 steps. And so I found myself with another task of interpreting the way of recovery from the incurable disease of alcoholism. From then on, the dominant interest in my life was AA, and it still is. A probable explanation for my interest in alcoholics is my own experience of getting drunk twice, when I was 17 and again at 22, shortly after I joined the British Army for the First World War. I was horribly ill both times, and I have never tried the experiment again. But it made me wonder why people got drunk time after time, and that some people seemed to be seldom sober. 50 years or so ago, I was lent a book by an authority on the subject, and I discovered that some people are victims of a disease, dipsomania, which is incurable. In the early 1930s, I was asked to review a book which represented the account of 25 years' experience in a clinic in Boston, the United States, which dealt with all types of diseases and was called Body, Mind and Spirit. This book also stated dipsomania was an incurable disease. Only really, and then the patient had to be utterly desperate and with strong motivation could a sufferer recover through a spiritual experience and would never be able to drink alcohol for the rest of his life, his or her life. That was an explanation which made sense to me. Alcoholism, as we now call this disease, is concerned with body, mind and spirit, a threefold disease. I had been interested in what is known as divine healing, and I had an intimate knowledge of several people who were healed by prayer from what were regarded as illnesses beyond medical help. When I read about the work of AA in the United States of America, I was thrilled. I hoped to hear of the movement coming to Australia, and Archie's visit was the fulfillment of a great hope, and I was prepared to do all in my power to assist the struggling group in Australia. My work had always been concerned with people. After the First World War, I was for several years engaged in parish work as an Anglican priest. Not only was I involved with the divine healing, but with industrial strife and the conflict, and industrial strife and conflict, which became a dominant interest. I went to the United States of America and England lecturing in cooperation in industry instead of confrontation. After some years, it was quite plain that my efforts were not bearing any fruit, and I was seeking another cause. I resigned from the ministry after some years of editing a religious paper, and I became a secular journalist. During the aftermath of the Depression, my paper folded up, and so I went into the new field of radio. In a short time, my session, Let's Talk It Over, had quite a large following and was relayed from 2GB to Melbourne and central New South Wales. Archie's invitation gave me the greatest opportunity of my life to help AA in Australia get off the ground. To be a voice broadcasting the good news that the incurable could now recover, that the hopeless may now find hope, seemed to me the greatest of causes. I do believe that all my past experiences and training was to fit me to help what I came to realize is the only certain way of recovery from a disease that is incurable, a disease that is the most serious social problem and the third greatest killer after heart disease and cancer. But any help that I may have been privileged to give to AA was more than rewarded by what my involvement with AA did for me. It is just an illustration of what Francis of Assisi in his great prayer said: it is by giving that we receive. It so happened that when I made contact with AA, I was in a severe spiritual crisis. I was faced with a problem about which I could do nothing. I was helpless, I was frustrated, and filled with resentment and hate. When I read the big book, and I came to the chapters dealing with the 12 steps, I felt this was the way to deal with my problem. And so I worked through the steps for my own needs, and I was interpreting the program for that first little group of alcoholics through my own experience. Apart from the physical allergy that made them alcoholics, I was no different from them with regard to the character defects which many of the steps deal. Or rather, all of the steps really deal with character defects. Even the first step I could share to the extent that I was defeated by my problem, and that in that respect my life had become unmanageable. And when I considered the second step, I found no difficulty, for I knew full well that I needed help from that power whom the AA calls God. But it was the third step that was a revelation of my spiritual poverty. I had been a man of religion. I had preached religion. I had seen miracles of healing through prayer. But now I realized that my belief in God was purely intellectual. I had never made a complete surrender of my life and my will to God. That was the heart of my problem. I had witnessed miracles of healing as a spectator. I was not personally involved. I have met with so many priests and religious men in AA, and I feel that their basic problem was the same. My first reading of the Serenity Prayer was a shock. I rebelled at first. Why should I accept what had been done to me? That wonderful prayer asks God for 4 gifts: serenity, acceptance, courage, and wisdom. By accepting the fact that I couldn't solve my problem, I had, through the third step, to turn my will and my life over to God. That surrender gave me a wonderful sense of peace of mind, serenity. I was now free from the pride that made serenity impossible. It was a beginning of another lesson in humility. The third petition of that prayer was granted. I was given the courage to face myself without reservations and rationalizations. I was ready to take the 4th step and begin my inventory. I had made many a confession of my sins, but only of my sins. I never realized that what I had done was not so important as why I had done those things. Chapter 5 of the big book taught me to uncover the motive. For in that way I would get at the root of my offense, my self-centeredness. It took weeks to complete the inventory, and it was a painful process, tracking my misdeeds to their source, my stinking thinking. That is where the motives lay. First, the inventory was chronological, from my earliest memories and all through my life. Then I examined myself with regard to the 7 deadly sins of pride, anger, envy, greed, lust, avarice, and sloth, which latter, that is sloth, Bill Wilson said, is only prevarication in 5 letters. Next, I had to consider a suitable person to make the 5th step with. I chose a priest of an Anglican religious order, and he consented to give me a morning, for I told him it would take time for me to get through my inventory. I can only describe the way in which I felt after my session with the priest as exhilaration. It was wonderful to know that I had broken the power of the past to torment me with guilt and remorse. Now I could really begin to live a day at a time, for my past had been sterilized. Naturally, I would remember the wrongs that I had done, but just as false to be accepted. The future I had put into the hands of God, so I could concentrate on today. Since I was not a solitary being, but a member of a family and of the community, one had to make plans and appointments, but that being done, the rest is in the hands of God. The 6th step made me have a look at my present situation. Had I really been ready to ask God to remove all the defects of character which were still with me? The past had been dealt with, but character defects that were entrenched in habits are not easily got rid of. One has to have a sincere desire to have God break the habit. But I still have the power of choice. I still have the power of choice which God never overrules. My cooperation is necessary. But how can I fully cooperate if there is still a reluctance to give up a habit which still gives me some satisfaction? No wonder Bill Wilson says that someone described the 6th step as the one which separates the men from the boys. When I felt that I was ready humbly to ask God to remove these shortcomings, I passed on to the 7th step. The key word is in this short sentence is humility. Humbly asked him to remove the imperfections. Bill Wilson has stressed in all his writings the need for humility, and the whole of the 12 steps are exercises in humility. Humility enabled us to admit our helplessness in the 1st step and to carry on its lessons in the succeeding steps, for there can be no spiritual progress without humility. And there is no standing still. We are either progressing or slipping back. Humbly asking God to remove shortcomings means the full surrender of our will to God's will. I hope my sincere desire to do this would be accepted. Having made my peace with my conscience and with God, it was now necessary to make my peace with any person that I have harmed in any way. Making a list of such persons was a painful process. I had dealt with this problem in my 4th and 5th steps, but now concentrating on this aspect of really laying the ghosts of the past, I again suffered great sorrow. about my neglect of my mother. I never returned to my home after the war. I went to New Zealand and after 8 years to Australia. My letters to her were few and far between. Although I could have sent her money regularly, for she was now a widow, only once did I do this. I was content for my eldest half-brother to look after my own mother. I could only again leave this into the care of a merciful and loving God. I apologized to two men that I had offended and who didn't speak to me again because they were so hurt. I apologized without excusing myself, and to my great relief, they gladly accepted my apologies. Now I had no person with a grievance against me, as far as I knew. I had no enemies. I was at peace with all my fellow men. The sixth step had jolted me into the need for constant vigilance. The price of freedom from the danger of a relapse into the former bad habits is to continue to take inventory, as the 10th step warns us. It is a good habit to review briefly our day before we sleep. If we have nothing to regret, or we feel that we have handled a difficult situation well, let us thank God for His help. If, on the other hand, we have perhaps lost our temper, or said hurtful things, or did not promptly admit it and apologize, well, we make a firm resolution to set things right at the very first opportunity and to ask for God's forgiveness. The 11th step is one that I had been practicing from when I took the third step. I have to thank AA for making me go to school and learn to meditate. Meditation is a spiritual exercise that is essential to spiritual development, and we have to learn how to do it. One needs to go to an expert, and I sought out books that taught meditation, and I studied them. Every Catholic religious order has its own method of meditation. I found the Ignatian method very helpful. It is practiced by the Jesuits. Meditation is not prayer, but a prelude to prayer. The 11th step revolutionized my concept of prayer by its concentration on God's will for us and the power to carry that out. That is our greatest need. I also felt more and more how much I should pray for others, that they, too, may surrender themselves to God's care. I couldn't know what was best for them. Only God knows their motives and their needs. The 12th step explains why I continue to go to as many AA meetings as I can. I have so much to thank AA for that if any group feels that I have something to contribute, I am glad to share with them my own spiritual pilgrimage through the 12 steps. Over the past 30 years, it gives me a feeling of profound gratitude to God that He placed me in a position to help this great, wonderful, worldwide fellowship in some way. My personal friendship with my many AA friends is very precious. Increasingly, I have come to realize that AA is indeed unique. It has been guided to avoid the dangers of wealth and authority. those twin dangers that have spoilt or rendered fruitless the efforts of so many spiritual societies throughout the centuries. No money is accepted from outsiders. AA is entirely self-supporting, and even that is regulated to avoid a member making too large a gift. There is no personal control. The fellowship has no boss. As the second tradition puts it, for our group purposes, there is but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself to our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. After 30 years, I am constantly studying the 12 steps, for I still find my greatest need is to conquer one's own self, and this needs humility. Only by humility can I have God's help. And that is why the 12th tradition states that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of our traditions, reminding us to place principles before personalities. This means the naughting of the self and avoidance of all personal praise in publicity through radio, television, and the press. AA is the first worldwide society which practices this public anonymity, and it is the result of the 12 steps training in humility. This is Frank Sturge Hardy just saying that this was recorded in Russ's home on the 3rd of December, 76. I think it was in 1947 that Bill Wilson sent to me by an AA member who had from Australia who had visited him a card on which there was a little message for me, thanking me for the help that I had given, that I've been very fortunate in having the opportunity of giving to AA in Australia. A little message. And on the other side was the prayer of Francis of Assisi, what is known as the Peace Prayer. I realized when I got the book, AA Comes of Age, some years later, that Francis of Assisi had exerted a considerable influence on Bill himself. And I think that his subsequent spiritual development owed a great deal to Francis of Assisi. I think his conception of AA, which gradually developed after Mr. Rockefeller had given him quite a jolt about money, he began to realize the virtue of poverty. And so, in the traditions, you have a tradition there which makes it impossible for AA to be a very wealthy society, because since all contributions from outside sources are cut off, forbidden, well, therefore, AA depends upon the generosity of those who have achieved sobriety through the program of recovery. Even so, the contribution of, say, a wealthy member of AA is limited. And therefore, I think there's a touch of Francis of Assisi's devotion to, as he called it, My Lady Poverty. Well, now, this prayer is a remarkable prayer, and I want to share my frequent meditations they really are. For I have, for some time, I have recited that prayer very slowly every day, and frequently meditated on a certain phases in that prayer. And so I want to share with you the result of those meditations, and also the help that I have received from a book that was published not very long ago, of the meditations of a great South African, a man who is still on in house arrest in South Africa because of his opposition to apartheid. He printed his meditations on that beautiful prayer. And so I have to acknowledge that a good many of my ideas, my thoughts, have been perhaps given through him, or come to me through him. But now I better recite the prayer first of all, and then just make a comment, meditation on the every different Lord, make